Imagine standing inside the Forbidden City on a winter morning in 1912. The vermilion walls are still there. The golden rooftops still catch the pale light. The ceremonial drums are silent. And a 6-year-old boy, dressed in the robes of the Son of Heaven, sits on the dragon throne. The last emperor of a dynasty that had ruled China for nearly 3 centuries, in a line of civilization stretching back more than 4,000 years. His name is Puyi, and outside those walls, the empire is already gone. This is the story of how one of the greatest dynasties in human history, the Qing, collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, the shock of foreign aggression, the fury of its own people, and the inexorable pressure of a world that was changing faster than any emperor could comprehend. It is a story not of a single catastrophic moment, but of a slow and agonizing unraveling, of pride refusing to yield until there was nothing left to hold, of reforms that came too late, of rebellions that could not be stopped, and of a civilization forced to confront the gap between what it believed itself to be and what the world was becoming. To understand the fall, you must first understand the height, because the Qing dynasty did not begin as a story of weakness. It began as a story of conquest. In the early 17th century, a semi-nomadic people from the northeast, the Manchu, had been building power along the borders of the Ming dynasty. The Ming were ancient by then, bloated with bureaucracy, hollowed by corruption, and bleeding from peasant rebellions that had spread like wildfire across the provinces. When the rebel leader Li Zicheng seized Beijing in 1644 and the last Ming emperor hanged himself from a tree on a hill behind the Forbidden City, the Manchu were waiting. They crossed the Great Wall not as invaders, but as allies, invited by a desperate Ming general who needed their cavalry. And once they were inside, they never left. The Manchu established the Qing dynasty on the wreckage of the old order. They were outsiders, foreigners in the eyes of the Han Chinese majority, and they knew it. From the very beginning, they governed with a careful, calculated brilliance. They kept the Confucian bureaucratic structure that had organized Chinese society for centuries. They honored Chinese traditions, performed Chinese rituals, and adopted the Chinese language for official correspondence alongside their own. They presented themselves not as conquerors replacing Chinese civilization, but as its rightful inheritors and protectors. And for generations, it worked. The early Qing emperors were extraordinary men. The Kangxi emperor, who reigned from 1661 to 1722, was one of the longest-reigning rulers in Chinese history. He was a scholar, a military commander, and a political strategist of rare ability. Under his rule, China expanded its territory, suppressed major rebellions, and established stable relations with neighboring kingdoms. He invited Jesuit astronomers and mathematicians to his court, not because he was naive about Western knowledge, but because he was curious and pragmatic. He understood that information was power. He absorbed what was useful and discarded what threatened the order he was building. His grandson, the Qianlong Emperor, pushed the dynasty to its territorial peak. By the late 18th century, the Qing Empire was one of the largest empires on Earth, encompassing China proper, Manchuria, Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, and Taiwan. The imperial treasury was full. The population was growing. Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea were flowing outward along trade routes that stretched to Europe. And within the empire, a cultural confidence had taken root. The belief that China was not merely one civilization among many, but the center of civilization itself. The Middle Kingdom, the place from which all proper order radiated outward. This confidence was not entirely without basis. For most of human history, China had been one of the most economically and technologically advanced societies on Earth. Chinese inventors had developed paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass centuries before Europe. Chinese cities were larger and more complex than anything in the medieval West, and the Confucian system of governance, with its emphasis on education, meritocracy, and moral order, had produced a stable, sophisticated bureaucracy that could manage a vast territory across enormous distances. The world had come to China. Tribute states sent their envoys to Beijing. Merchants sought access to Chinese markets. The assumption that the world would continue to come to China on China's terms felt like simple common sense. But history is never kind to civilizations that mistake their present greatness for a permanent condition. The cracks in the foundation began appearing before most people wanted to see them. By the late 18th century, the population had grown dramatically, faster than the agricultural base could sustainably support. Land was becoming scarce. Peasant poverty was deepening. Provincial officials, far from the reach of Beijing, were increasingly corrupt, skimming taxes, extorting the weak, and filling local coffers at the expense of the population they were supposed to govern. The Confucian ideal of virtuous governance was becoming, in many places, a polite fiction stretched over naked exploitation. At the same time, a new force was appearing on China's coasts, and the Qing court was slow to understand what it represented. European merchants, primarily the British, operating through the East India Company, were hungry for Chinese goods. Tea, silk, and porcelain flowed west in enormous quantities. But the Chinese had little interest in European goods in return. The trade was deeply imbalanced. Silver was flowing into China. British merchants were frustrated. And in the warehouses of the East India Company, a solution was being cultivated in the poppy fields of Bengal. Opium. Opium had been used in China for centuries as medicine. But large-scale recreational use, the kind that creates mass addiction, had been officially banned. The British, however, were not asking for permission. In the early 19th century, they began flooding the Chinese market with Indian opium on a commercial scale never seen before. The effects were catastrophic. Millions of Chinese became addicted. Silver, which had been flowing into China for generations, began flowing out to pay for the drug. Provincial economies were destabilized. The military and bureaucracy were riddled with addicts. And in Beijing, the court was increasingly alarmed. In 1839, the Daoguang Emperor decided he had seen enough. He appointed a resolute and morally serious official named Lin Zexu as Imperial Commissioner to Guangzhou, the primary trading port, with orders to end the opium trade. Lin Zexu did not equivocate. He seized over 20,000 chests of British-owned opium and destroyed them, dissolved in salt water and lime and washed into the sea. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria appealing to her conscience, asking how she could countenance the poisoning of the Chinese people for profit. Queen Victoria never replied. Instead, the British government sent warships. The First Opium War, which began in 1839, was not a contest. The Qing military, built for the kind of cavalry warfare that had swept the steppe 3 centuries earlier, was shattered by British naval gunfire and modern infantry tactics. The Qing soldiers fought with courage in places, but courage against smoothbore muskets and Congreve rockets is a limited resource. By 1842, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, and the world China had known was gone. The treaty was a humiliation of almost theatrical proportions. Britain received Hong Kong. 5 ports were opened to British trade and residents. Enormous indemnities were paid. And, most critically, the principle of extraterritoriality was established, meaning British citizens in China would be subject to British law, not Chinese law. China was sovereign on paper and penetrated in practice. More treaties followed with France, America, and others. Each one carved out another exception, another concession, another slice of sovereignty. wrapped in the language of commerce and civilization. The Qing court did not fully understand what was happening, or rather, many within it refused to understand. The dominant response was not reform, but rationalization. These were border events, coastal problems, manageable disturbances. The dynasty had weathered rebellions before. It had survived invasions. It had absorbed conquerors. Surely this too would pass. The emperor was still the son of heaven. The rituals were still performed. The bureaucracy was still in place. Surely the foundation was sound. It was not sound. And the proof came not from the outside, but from within. In 1850, a man named Hong Xiuquan launched a rebellion in southern China that would become one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Hong was a failed civil service candidate who had suffered a breakdown and, during his illness, had visions he believed were divine revelations. He became convinced that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, called to establish a heavenly kingdom on earth. What he built was the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, a millenarian movement that combined Christian imagery with traditional Chinese grievances about poverty, inequality, and Qing misrule. The Taiping Rebellion spread with terrifying speed. By 1853, Hong's forces had captured Nanjing, the ancient southern capital, and held it as their headquarters. The Taiping controlled a vast swathe of the most populous and economically productive regions of China. Tens of millions of people lived under their rule, or in the path of their armies. The fighting that followed was of almost unimaginable ferocity on both sides. Entire cities were depopulated. Provinces were left in ruins. The final death toll, from battle, massacre, famine, and disease, is estimated by scholars at somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. It remains one of the bloodiest civil wars in history. The Qing survived the Taiping Rebellion, but only barely, and the cost was transformative. The central government, already weakened, was forced to rely on regional warlords and their privately raised armies to crush the Taiping. Men like Zheng Guofan built personal military and political machines that operated outside the formal imperial structure. Power that had flowed to Beijing began pooling in the provinces. The state did not collapse, but it was no longer fully in control of its own territory. It had survived by delegating authority. It could not recover. While the Taiping War was still burning in the south, the British and French came again from the sea. The Second Opium War, which escalated in the late 1850s, was even more humiliating than the first. Anglo-French forces marched on Beijing itself. The Xianfeng Emperor fled north to Manchuria, leaving behind a capital that foreign troops entered with fire and contempt. The Old Summer Palace, the Yuanming Yuan, a complex of gardens, pavilions, and art collections built over generations by Qing emperors, was looted and burned. The destruction was systematic and deliberate. A message written in smoke and ash, addressed to the court and to every Chinese who watched the sky go red over Beijing. More treaties followed, more concessions, more ports, more special privileges for foreign nationals. And in the background, running beneath every negotiation and every conflict, the trade in opium continued to flow, draining silver, eroding livelihoods, and hollowing out the social fabric of a civilization that had once believed it needed nothing from the outside world. By the 1860s, a small group of reformers within the Qing court had begun to push for what they called self-strengthening, the idea that China could adopt Western military technology and industrial methods while preserving the essential Confucian social and cultural order. They built arsenals. They established modern shipyards. They created schools where young Chinese could study Western science, mathematics, and languages. They sent students abroad. They were serious people, working against enormous resistance, trying to thread an almost impossible needle. The self-strengthening movement produced real achievements. China built a modern navy. It developed modern weapons. It established institutions that would matter later. But it was operating inside a system that resisted the fundamental changes it needed to make. The Confucian bureaucracy was structured around classical learning and examination, not technical expertise. The officials who had spent their lives mastering the Confucian canon were not going to yield power to engineers and scientists they barely understood. The reforms were adopted at the edges, but not at the core. China got a modern navy. It did not get the modern state capable of deploying that navy effectively. The proof came in 1894 with devastating clarity. Japan, a nation that had undergone a far more radical modernization in the decades since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, went to war with China over Korea. The Sino-Japanese War lasted less than a year. The Chinese Beiyang fleet, which reformers had spent decades and enormous treasure building, was destroyed at the Battle of the Yellow Sea. Chinese land forces were routed, and in 1895, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Shimonoseki, ceding Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula to Japan, paying an enormous indemnity and recognizing Korean independence from Chinese suzerainty. The shock of defeat by Japan, a country that many in China had long regarded as a cultural satellite, a student of Chinese civilization, was profound. If the Opium Wars had humiliated the Qing court, the defeat by Japan alarmed an entire educated class. Something was deeply, structurally wrong. The question was no longer whether China needed to change, but how deeply and how quickly. The answer, for a brief and brilliant moment, seemed to come from the top. In 1898, the young Guangxu emperor, frustrated by the failures of self-strengthening and surrounded by reformist advisors, most notably the radical thinker Kang Yue, launched what became known as the 100 Days Reform. In the space of roughly 3 months, between June and September of 1898, the emperor issued an extraordinary cascade of edicts, reforming the civil service examination, modernizing education, restructuring the military, encouraging industry and commerce, and reorganizing the bureaucracy along more efficient lines. The reformers around him burned with urgency. They believed that only radical transformation could save the dynasty and the country. They were right, but they had badly miscalculated the resistance they would face. That resistance had a name, a face, and absolute power: Empress Dowager Cixi. Cixi had dominated Qing politics for decades. She had entered the Forbidden City as a low-ranking concubine in the 1850s and had maneuvered over decades into a position of extraordinary influence. She was not a simple reactionary. Historians who paint her purely as a villain misread her. She was a skilled political survivor who had kept the dynasty alive through catastrophic crises. But she was also deeply suspicious of the reformers around Guangxu, certain that their agenda threatened not just the conservative order she had built, but the dynasty itself. In September 1898, she moved. In a palace coup of breathtaking speed, Cixi placed the Guangxu emperor under house arrest on an island in the Imperial Lakes. 6 of the leading reformers were executed. Kang Yue fled into exile. The reform edicts were cancelled. The 100 Days Reform was over. China's last real chance for managed, evolutionary modernization from within the existing imperial system had been extinguished by the very system it sought to save. The conservatives had won, but their victory planted a seed they could not control. The humiliations kept coming. In the late 1890s, as European powers observed China's weakness with predatory attention, there was a scramble for concessions that looked uncomfortably like a preview of what had happened in Africa. Germany seized Jiaozhou Bay after the murder of 2 German missionaries. Russia extended its leasehold in Manchuria. Britain took Weihaiwei. France tightened its grip in the south. The image of China as a fat melon being sliced apart, the cutting of the melon, as it was known, became a symbol in the foreign press of a nation helpless before the appetites of stronger powers. Inside China, the anger was becoming combustible. And in the countryside of Shandong province, a movement was forming that would bring that anger to a catastrophic boiling point. The Boxers, the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, were a movement that defies simple categorization. They drew on folk religion, martial arts traditions, and a profound sense of grievance against foreign missionaries, foreign goods, and the Chinese Christians who had attached themselves to the privileges and protections that foreigners enjoyed. They believed, with sincere and terrible conviction, that their practices made them invulnerable to Western bullets. They marched against the foreign presence in China with a fury that was as much spiritual as political, and they were moving toward Beijing. In the summer of 1900, in a decision that stands as perhaps the single worst strategic choice in the dynasty's final decades, the Qing court decided to support the Boxers. Cixi, surrounded by deeply anti-foreign advisors who told her what she wanted to hear, declared war on 11 foreign nations simultaneously. The Boxers and Imperial troops laid siege to the foreign legation quarter in Beijing, a compound where thousands of foreigners and Chinese Christians had taken refuge. The siege lasted 55 days. The foreign powers responded by assembling an expeditionary force of 8 nations. The Boxer rebellion was crushed with brutal efficiency. The Allied armies entered Beijing in August 1900. Cixi and the captive Guangxu emperor fled the capital disguised as peasants. The empress, who had ruled China for decades, fleeing her own forbidden city in a farm cart. Foreign troops occupied Beijing, looted palaces and temples, and imposed the Boxer Protocol of 1901, a settlement so punishing that some historians argue it administered the fatal wound to the dynasty. The Boxer Protocol required China to pay an indemnity equivalent to many times the government's annual revenue, payable over 39 years. Foreign troops were stationed permanently in Beijing. Chinese officials who had supported the Boxers were punished. The dynasty's military and fiscal capacity was further gutted. It was, stripped of diplomatic language, the tribute of the defeated, imposed not by a single conqueror, but by a consortium of powers who had collectively decided that China would remain open, pliable, and financially exploitable. When Cixi finally returned to Beijing in January 1902, she was, on the surface, the same imperious figure she had always been. But something had changed. The shock of the flight, the humiliation of the terms, and the evidence of the dynasty's military impotence had apparently cracked through even her considerable capacity for denial. In the years after 1901, Cixi embarked on a program of reforms that would have been unthinkable coming from her a decade earlier. The very reforms she had crushed in 1898. The civil service examination, which had organized Chinese intellectual life for over 1,000 years, was abolished in 1905. Constitutional government was promised. Modern schools were established. Military modernization was accelerated. A commission was sent abroad to study foreign constitutions. The reforms were real, but they were also, in a tragic and almost ironic sense, too much and too late simultaneously. Too much, because each reform loosened the bonds that held the old order together, educated a new generation that didn't believe in the old justifications, trained a new officer class that had ambitions beyond loyalty to the throne, created expectations that the dynasty could not satisfy. Too late, because the damage was done, the credibility was gone, and the people who needed to believe in the dynasty no longer did. Outside the structure of the state, another movement was growing, not in the palace, but in exile halls. overseas Chinese communities, and the new modern schools. Its leader was a man named Sun Yat-sen, a physician from Guangdong who had grown up partly in Hawaii and Hong Kong, who had absorbed Western democratic theory and found in it a vision for what China could become. Sun was not a military man or a traditional rebel leader. He was an organizer, a fundraiser, and an idealist of tremendous energy and considerable charisma. He wanted to end the Qing dynasty. He wanted to end the imperial system entirely. He wanted a republic. Sun organized multiple failed uprisings through the 1890s and 1900s, attempts to spark a military revolt that would topple the Qing. They all failed, but they built networks, nurtured connections, and spread ideas. And the army that the Qing had been modernizing, the new army, trained with Western methods, officered by graduates of modern military schools, was increasingly infiltrated by revolutionary cells sympathetic to Sun's vision. The dynasty was building the instrument of its own destruction and paying for it from its shrunken treasury. Then, on the 10th of October, 1911, a small explosion changed everything. In Wuchang, a city in central China, the accidental detonation of bombs being prepared by a revolutionary cell forced the conspirators' hand. Rather than be arrested and identified from recovered membership lists, the revolutionary soldiers in the Wuchang garrison mutinied. They seized the city. A reluctant Qing commander named Li Yuanhong, dragged from under a bed where he had been hiding, was persuaded at gunpoint to lead the rebellion. What happened next was not so much a revolution as a dissolution. Province after province declared independence from the Qing, some out of genuine revolutionary conviction, some out of opportunism, some simply because the central authority had become so weak that declarations seemed both safe and advantageous. Within 2 months, 15 of China's 22 provinces had seceded. The Qing dynasty, which had governed China for over 2.5 centuries, was left with little more than Beijing and its immediate environs. Cixi had died in 1908, characteristically one day after the Guangxu emperor, whose imprisonment she had ordered, passed away under circumstances that have never been fully explained. The throne passed to a 2-year-old boy, Puyi. His regent was his father, Prince Chun, a man entirely unsuited for the crisis he was inheriting. As provinces fell away and the court scrambled, one name emerged as the dynasty's last possible salvation: Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai was the most powerful military figure in China, the man who had built the new army, who had the loyalty of the modern military force, and who had been dismissed from power by the regent in 1909 out of fear and jealousy. Now, desperately, the court recalled him. But Yuan Shikai was not a loyalist playing a role in someone else's story. He was a pragmatist playing his own game. He negotiated simultaneously with the revolutionaries in the south and the court in Beijing, using each side's desperation as leverage against the other. In February 1912, Yuan Shikai delivered to the Qing court the news that there was no path forward. The dynasty had to abdicate. The Empress Dowager Longyu, widow of the Guangxu emperor, now regent for the child Puyi, wept. She argued. She sought alternatives that did not exist. And then, on February 12, 1912, she signed the Edict of Abdication on behalf of the 6-year-old emperor. The edict used the language of Confucian virtue, the dynasty yielding power for the good of the people, recognizing the will of heaven, surrendering the mandate it no longer possessed. It was graceful in its phrasing and devastating in its implications. After more than 2,000 years of imperial rule, since the first Qin emperor unified China in 221 BC, the institution of the Chinese emperor was gone. But endings are rarely clean, and this one was not. The Republic of China that succeeded the Qing was almost immediately captured by Yuan Shikai, who had engineered the transition and had no intention of becoming anyone's subordinate. He sidelined Sun Yat-sen and the revolutionary movement. He ruled the new republic as a strongman, and in 1915 even attempted to restore the monarchy, with himself as emperor. The attempt failed, humiliatingly, and Yuan died in 1916 with his ambitions in ruins and his legacy in tatters. What followed was the warlord era, a decade and more of fragmentation, as military strongmen divided China into personal fiefdoms and fought each other with foreign support and domestic suffering. The civilization that had prided itself on order and continuity fell into a chaos more extreme than anything the Qing, for all their failures, had ever permitted. Foreign powers deepened their exploitation of the fragmented country. The people who had hoped that the end of the dynasty would bring a better China found themselves living through something that felt, to many, considerably worse. And yet, underneath the chaos, something important was happening. The end of the imperial system had broken open a dam. Ideas that had circulated in exile and in whispers were now moving openly through Chinese society. The generation that grew up after 1912, that attended the new schools, read the new newspapers, encountered the new ideologies, was a generation without a fixed framework for understanding the world. The old certainties were gone. In their place was a ferocious, searching hunger for answers. The May 4th movement of 1919, sparked by the outrage of Chinese students at the Versailles Peace Conference, which awarded German concessions in China to Japan, rather than returning them to Chinese sovereignty, became a cultural explosion of remarkable intensity. Young Chinese intellectuals turned on Confucianism, on tradition, on the entire structure of values that had defined Chinese civilization for millennia. They embraced science, democracy, and a range of Western and revolutionary ideas with the urgency of people who believe their civilization is at stake. Among the ideas circulating in those ferment years was Marxism. Among the young people drawn to it was a teacher's assistant at the Beijing University Library named Mao Zedong. The fall of the Qing dynasty did not simply change who sat on the throne, or even whether there was a throne at all. It cracked open the question of what China was, what it should be, what it could become, how it should relate to its own past and to the world that had humiliated it. That question, once opened, could not be closed. It generated a century of struggle. Civil war between nationalists and communists, Japanese invasion, more civil war, revolution, and ultimately the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, which presented itself as the final answer to the crisis that the fall of the Qing had exposed. Whether it was the final answer is a question the living still debate. But the fall of the dynasty made the question unavoidable. Consider what the Qing dynasty's collapse represented in scale. Not merely a change of government, not merely a transfer of power from one ruling house to another, as had happened many times before in Chinese history. This was the end of a system. The entire framework of emperor, mandate, Confucian hierarchy, and tributary order that had organized one of the world's largest civilizations for over 2 millennia. The Forbidden City, which had been the unambiguous center of the known world for the men who lived within it, became a museum. The rituals that had connected heaven and earth through the person of the emperor were discontinued. The examination system that had structured Chinese intellectual ambition for 1,000 years was gone. The language of cosmic legitimacy, the mandate of heaven, the son of heaven, the rhythms of dynasty rising and falling in accordance with moral order, was replaced by the borrowed language of republics and constitutions and national sovereignty. Nothing of this magnitude falls cleanly. There are always those who cling to what was. Pu Yi himself, the last emperor, lived a life of extraordinary symbolic weight and personal tragedy. After the abdication, the Qing court was allowed to remain in the Forbidden City under a set of articles of favorable treatment, living in a strange, suspended state, the forms of imperial life maintained without the substance of imperial power. In 1924, a warlord unceremoniously expelled him. He fled to the foreign concession in Tianjin. In 1932, the Japanese installed him as the nominal emperor of their puppet state of Manchukuo in northeastern China. Using the last remnant of Qing legitimacy as a tool of imperial Japanese policy. After Japan's defeat in 1945, he was captured by the Soviets, handed to the Chinese Communists, subjected to years of ideological re-education, and ultimately released as a reformed citizen of the People's Republic, dying in 1967 as a gardener in Beijing. His life contained more history than any single person should have to carry. The story of the Qing's fall is, in the deepest sense, a story about the cost of refusing to face hard truths. The Qing were not uniquely foolish or uniquely corrupt. They were a sophisticated governing elite who had maintained a complex civilization across extraordinary challenges. But they carried, embedded in the very foundations of their self-understanding, the assumption that Chinese civilization was the standard by which the rest of the world would eventually be measured. That the world would come to China rather than China having to meet the world. When the world arrived with gunships and demanded terms, the cognitive dissonance was so severe that the dynasty's response was decades of half-measures, internal resistance, and repeated failure to grasp the depth of the transformation required. The reformers who tried to change from within were real. Lin Zexu's moral clarity was real. The self-strengthener's urgency was real. The Guangxu Emperor's courage during the 100 Days Reform was real. But none of them had the power to overcome the institutional inertia of a system that had been optimized for stability rather than adaptation, and that confused the preservation of its own structures with the preservation of civilization itself. Empires tell themselves stories about why they deserve to last. The Qing told themselves the story of the mandate of heaven, that right conduct, proper ritual, and moral order guaranteed heaven's favor, and therefore continued power. When the evidence began to suggest that heaven's favor was not forthcoming, the temptation was always to blame individuals, the wrong advisors, the corrupt officials, the perfidious foreigners, rather than to examine the story itself. That examination, when it finally came, was so destabilizing that it took generations to work through. China worked through it. The civilization did not end with the dynasty. It transformed, violently, painfully, at enormous human cost, into something that is still in the process of defining itself. The questions first forced open by the fall of the Qing remain alive. How a civilization maintains its identity while adapting to a changing world. What the relationship between tradition and transformation should be. How a great people recovers dignity after humiliation. How power should be organized in a society of 1 billion people, with 4,000 years of recorded history. These are not historical questions. They are living ones. That small boy on the dragon throne in 1912, Puyi, dressed in robes too large for his 6-year-old body, surrounded by the dying forms of a dying order, carried in his person the weight of everything that had come before and the uncertainty of everything that would follow. He did not know on that winter morning in the Forbidden City that the world he had been born to govern had already slipped away. He would spend the rest of his long life learning what had been lost and what, against all odds, continued. The walls are still red. The rooftops are still gold. The tourists who walk through the Forbidden City today walk through the most visible monument to the dynasty that could not hold its own world together. and through the threshold of the China that rose from the ruins. History does not end. It transforms, and the transformation of China, begun in the final agonies of the Qing, is still unfolding. If you want to keep following the rise and fall of empires, the decisions that shaped civilizations, the moments when everything changed, the stories too consequential to forget, subscribe and stay close. There is always more history to uncover.